There is a people that does not fit on the map, not the geographical one, but the historical one. A people whose name we have heard thousands of times, whose ships we imagine in the purple twilight of the Mediterranean Sea, whose letters became the foundation of almost every alphabet we write with today. And yet, when we try to look them in the face, we see nothing, only a shadow, only an assumption, only a history that we have been told for so long that it has begun to seem like the truth. The Phoenicians. For generations, the history seemed settled, clean, convenient, almost too simple. A seafaring people from the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, merchants who brought purple, glass, cedar wood, the alphabet. A Semitic-speaking people related to the Canaanites, who appeared around the 3rd millennium before our era on a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea. They founded Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Berytus. Then they sailed west and founded Carthage. And then they disappeared, swallowed by Rome, assimilated by time. It was an understandable history, logical. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had geography and language. It had enemies and heroes. It even had a moral lesson about rising and falling. But then evidence appeared, and the old explanation began to crack. To understand how deep this crack is, one must first understand why the old version seemed so convincing. For almost 2,000 years, everything we knew about the Phoenicians came not from them themselves, but from others. From the Greeks, who admired them and feared them. From the Romans, who destroyed them. From Jewish scribes, who traded with them and married them. From the Egyptians, who paid them for timber. The Phoenicians themselves wrote a lot, but almost nothing of what they wrote has survived. Their archives, their literature, their religious texts, their historical chronicles, all of this disappeared. Papyrus does not survive in the humid climate of the coastal Levant. What has survived are short inscriptions on stone, coins, sarcophagi, snippets, fragments, shadows of a voice that once spoke to the whole world. So historians were forced to build an image of the Phoenicians from secondary sources, and this image was consistent enough. Semites, Canaanites, a people of the Levant, a people of the sea, a people with a clear geographical homeland and a clear ethnic identity. But there was always one detail that did not fit. The Phoenicians themselves, it seems, never called themselves Phoenicians. This word is Greek, phoinikes, perhaps from a word meaning purple, perhaps from the name of a legendary ancestor. No one knows for sure. And when the inhabitants of Tyre or Sidon spoke of themselves, they spoke as citizens of their cities, Tyrians, Sidonians, Biblians. They had no common national name. They had no common king. They had no single state. This seemed like a trifle, just a matter of terminology. But it was the first crack, because if the Phoenicians never considered themselves a single people, then who were they? And where did they come from? At first, this looked like an exception, a strange feature of the ancient world, where national identities were weaker than today. Historians brushed it off. They were Phoenicians, they were Canaanites, they were Semites. The question was settled. Then the evidence began to point in another direction. In the first years of the 2000s, a small group of researchers began to do what no one had done before. They began to extract DNA from bones, from ancient bones, from burials in Carthage, in Sardinia, in Lebanon, in Sicily, on the Spanish coast. They were looking for the genetic signatures of the Phoenician world. What they found was not what they expected. One of the first sensational results came from a burial in Carthage. A young man, buried about 25 centuries ago. He was nicknamed the Young Man of Byrsa, after the name of the hill on which he was found. It was expected that his DNA would show Levantine origins, Semitic genes, Canaanite roots. Instead, his maternal line turned out to be European, deeply European, a haplogroup common among the ancient inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula, a lineage that came from Europe long before the Phoenicians supposedly founded Carthage. It was one skeleton, one anomaly, perhaps an exception, perhaps a mistake, perhaps the son of a Phoenician merchant and a local woman. But then more skeletons appeared, and the picture began to change. In studies published over the last decade, geneticists analyzed dozens of ancient individuals from Punic and Phoenician settlements across the Mediterranean. The results were consistently strange. In Carthage, in Mocha in Sicily, in Spanish settlements, in Sardinia, people buried according to Phoenician rites, with Phoenician amulets, in Phoenician sarcophagi, could not be genetically distinguished from the local population. Their DNA did not point to the Levant. It pointed to the Mediterranean, to North Africa, to Iberia, to Sardinia, to Sicily, to the Greek islands. And then came another discovery, perhaps the strangest of all. When researchers analyzed the DNA of people buried in Lebanon itself, in the territory of ancient Tyre and Sidon, they found something unexpected. Levantine Phoenicians were hard to distinguish from the previous Canaanite inhabitants of the same land, but they also carried traces of genetic admixture from completely different regions, from the Aegean Sea, from Anatolia, from parts of Europe. Traces that appeared during the Bronze Age, in an era of great migrations and the collapse of civilizations. The old explanation was not useless, it was incomplete. And this is exactly where the history begins to split. Because if the Phoenicians of the Western Mediterranean were genetically mostly local inhabitants who adopted Phoenician culture, then what does it mean to be a Phoenician? It was not blood. It was not an ethnic group in the modern sense. It was something else, something much deeper and much more fluid. The data did not simplify the past. They made it older. Some researchers have suggested that the Phoenician civilization might be the first example of what we would now call a cultural network. Not a nation, not an empire, not an ethnic group, but a set of ideas, technologies, religious practices, and trade relations that spread from city to city, from port to port, uniting people of different origins under a common identity. Other researchers have suggested something even more radical, that the Phoenician identity might never have been an identity at all, that it was something we modern people invented in hindsight, a category we imposed on the ancient world to make it understandable to us. Each explanation seemed partially convincing. Each explanation left something unanswered. If the Phoenicians were a network, how was it organized? How did it maintain its integrity over centuries, across seas and continents, without a central government, without an imperial bureaucracy, without a common king? How did a merchant from Tyre and a craftsman from Carthage understand that they belonged to the same thing if they had never met, never spoken the same language, never shared the same ancestors? And if the Phoenicians of the Western Mediterranean were mostly local inhabitants who adopted Levantine culture, then how did this culture come to them? Was it brought by Phoenician colonists in small numbers, spreading their customs like a drop of ink in water? Or was it something more complex, in which local populations actively adopted and transformed Phoenician ideas for their own purposes? The data pointed to one thing. Archaeology pointed to another. Ancient texts pointed to a third, and then came the biggest surprise of all. When researchers began to compare ancient Phoenician DNA with modern populations in the Mediterranean, they found something no one expected. The genetic traces of the Phoenician world are not concentrated where we might expect to find them. They are not concentrated in Lebanon. They are not concentrated in Tunisia. They are not concentrated in Carthage. They are scattered along the coast of Spain, across the islands of the Western Mediterranean, across North Africa, across parts of Italy and Greece. They appear in the least expected places, in isolated rural communities, in island populations that for centuries seemed forgotten by time. The Phoenicians did not disappear. They dissolved. They became part of dozens of other peoples, leaving no noticeable traces in any of them individually, but leaving a genetic imprint in all of them together.
This was not a tale of rise and fall. This was a tale of diffusion. And yet, even this did not explain everything. Because there was one more mystery. DNA traces that pointed not to the Levant, not to the Mediterranean, but to places even more distant. Tiny genetic signatures in ancient Phoenician burials that most closely resembled populations from the Caucasus, from the mountainous regions between the Black and Caspian Seas, regions that had no obvious connection to the Phoenician world. How did these traces get there? No one knows. Some have suggested that they reflect ancient migrations from the Bronze Age, when entire peoples moved vast distances due to the collapse of civilizations. Others have suggested that these are traces of trade relations for which we have no written evidence. Still others have suggested that these might be traces of even older migrations that predated the Phoenicians themselves, and that shaped the genetic landscape of the Levant long before the first merchants went to sea. What emerged was not a straight line, but a web. Imagine for a moment a quiet scene. It is Carthage, not at the moment of its destruction by Rome, but several centuries before that. A city at the height of its power. The harbor is full of ships. The air smells of salt and cedar smoke. Merchants shout in a dozen languages. A child runs through the streets, speaking the Punic language, wearing Carthaginian clothes, praying to Carthaginian gods. Her father was born in Sicily, her mother in Sardinia. Her paternal grandfather was an indigenous Berber inhabitant of North Africa. Her maternal great-grandmother came from the Iberian Peninsula. None of them were born in Tyre. None of them had ever seen the Levant. And yet they all call themselves Phoenicians. They are all part of something greater than blood. What does it mean to be a people when this people is not a nation, not an ethnic group, not an empire, but something much more complex? This is a question that the ancient Phoenicians perhaps never tried to answer. Because for them it was not a riddle, it was simply life. They were who they were. They did not need our modern category to understand themselves. It became a riddle for us, because we are the heirs of another world, a world in which identity is tied to blood, to a state, to a passport, to the language spoken in childhood. A world in which we expect peoples to have clear boundaries, clear histories, clear beginnings and ends. The Phoenicians do not fit into this world, and that is exactly why they are so important. They show us that human history has not always followed the rules we have imposed on it, that there were ways of being a people that we have forgotten. That identity could be something fluid, networked, voluntary, cultural, and yet strong enough to hold people together across thousands of kilometers and tens of generations. And this is not unique to the Phoenicians. The more we look into the ancient world using the tools of modern genetics, the less it resembles what we thought. The Greeks turn out to be genetically linked to people we would call Anatolians. The Romans turn out to be a melting pot of such a scale that the very idea of Roman identity breaks down into hundreds of component parts. The Celts turn out to be not a single people, but a series of cultural waves. The Vikings, a network of merchants and settlers carrying genes from all over Eurasia. The data did not destroy history, they deepened it. And yet there is something especially powerful in the case of the Phoenicians, because they were the first to turn the sea into a road, the first to connect the coasts of the Mediterranean into a single trading system, the first to invent an alphabet that anyone could read, not just priests, the first to show that a civilization does not need an empire to spread, and perhaps the first to show that a people does not need a single blood, a single land, a single king to exist. Think about this again. A civilization that lasted more than 1,000 years,
that gave the world its most fundamental tool of communication, that built cities on 3 continents, that traded with Egypt and Britain, with Mesopotamia and the Atlantic coast of Africa. And yet, when we extract DNA from its bones, we do not find one people, we find many. We find a network. We find an idea that became flesh, an identity that became blood, a culture that became a legacy. Perhaps this is exactly their greatest discovery. Not purple, not the alphabet, not ships, but the very idea that human identity can be something more than lineage, that we can choose who to be, that we can join something greater than the blood that flows in our veins. That is why the riddle of the Phoenicians was not solved. It was expanded. Because every new DNA finding, every new archaeological discovery, every newly read inscription reveals not a simpler history, but a more complex one. Not a narrower identity, but a broader one. Not a clearer image of a people, but an image that is a little more like us. Because we too are a network. Every one of us. Our DNA tells the story of tens of migrations, hundreds of crossings, thousands of generations of unknown ancestors who met in cities, in mountain passes, on coasts, in ports. We are all Phoenicians in a certain sense. We are all products of a network that is much broader than any nation can encompass. And yet we want simple stories. We want to know where we came from. We want a clear line connecting us to the past. We want to be part of something identifiable, named, understandable. The ancient Phoenicians remind us that this thirst might be a modern invention, that it was possible to live differently, to be part of something without the need to define it. Imagine another scene. It is not Carthage. It is Tyre, millennia ago, at the highest point of its power, an island city connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of stone and time. The sun sinks into the Mediterranean Sea. Ships return from distant ports, loaded with silver cargo, purple cloth, oil, wine, stories that no one wrote down. A priest climbs to the top of the temple of Melkart. He looks west, across the waves, in the direction of cities he will never see. Gades in Spain, Leptis Magna in Libya, Tarshish, perhaps, somewhere in the depths, places he knows only from the tales of sailors. And he knows, without having a name for it, that there, in those places, in his time, there are people who pray to the same gods, who speak the same language, who wear the same clothes. People with whom he does not share blood. People with whom he shares something else. The wind carries salt from the sea. The stone of the temple is cool beneath his feet. Somewhere in the city, a fire burns, casting an orange light on ivory-colored walls. And for one moment, before the sun completely sets, he feels what we, 2,500 years later, are finally beginning to understand. That being a people is not a matter of blood. It is a matter of choice. It is a matter of faith. It is a matter of a long, silent, collective effort to imagine ourselves together. And then night falls, and the priest descends from the temple, and the city continues its work, and the network continues its expansion. And for another 1,000 years, the Phoenician world will scatter across the entire Mediterranean, entangle with local peoples, merge into new forms, lose its name, but not its essence. Then Rome came, and Carthage was burned, and salt was scattered over its ruins. And the name of the Phoenicians became forbidden, became forgotten, became almost a legend. But DNA remembers. Stones remember. Letters remember. Every time we write a word on this page, we use the descendants of the Phoenician alphabet. Every time we cross the sea on a merchant ship, we follow their path. Every time we join a community that is not defined by blood, but by ideas, we emulate their invention. They did not disappear. They became us. Not genetically, but structurally, in the form of the civilization they helped to create. And this is perhaps the strangest part of the history, that a people whose true nature we are only beginning to understand with the help of modern science passed down to us not only their alphabet, not only their ships, not only their cities, but the very idea of what a connected world can look like. A world where identity is a network, where culture spreads faster than blood, where a people can exist without an empire, without a king, without a single land. This does not mean that the old history was completely wrong. The Tyrians and Sidonians were real. They spoke a Semitic language. They had Canaanite roots. Their culture grew in the specific landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. All of this is true, but this is only a part of the history, the beginning of the history, the first chapter. The rest of the history spread across 3 continents, in tens of languages, in hundreds of cities, in thousands of nameless settlements, in millions of people who called themselves Phoenicians, having nothing in common except culture, faith, and the sea. They were not what we thought, not because the old history was completely wrong, but because it was too small. The riddle was not solved, it was expanded, and perhaps this is exactly the true lesson of the dead, that the closer we look, the larger the past becomes, that every answer spawns 10 new questions. That history, like DNA, like the sea itself, has no bottom that we could touch, only a depth that continues to open before us the longer we sail. And somewhere in the silence of ancient stones, in the dust of forgotten tombs, in the silent letters on sarcophagi that no one can fully translate, the Phoenicians are still waiting, not to be understood, but to be heard, finally, as what they have always been. Not a people, but the idea of a people, the first idea of its kind, and perhaps not the last. The sea remembers everything. It is simply in no hurry to speak.